All right, good evening, everyone. It's 7 o'clock, so I started the recording. I see we have about 15 people already in the meeting. Well, maybe 3 of us are staff, or maybe more. But anyway, welcome. I am Carmen Bishop in the Zoning Administration Division, and this is a meeting about the Data Center Zoning Ordinance Amendment. And I'd like to introduce Janan Cato, also with Zoning Administration. And Janan's going to be helping to moderate this session, and Katie Herman with the Planning Division. And to see, I see Bill Mayland is also joining the meeting, and Bill is the Assistant Zoning Administrator. That's all the introductions I see so far. We'll see if anybody else joins on that I need to introduce. As you can see, I am going to start off the meeting by going through a few slides. While I do that, please stay muted. There will be plenty of time for questions and comments after the presentation. You are, of course, welcome to use the chat function as we go along. We will try to respond to any questions that are posed in the chat at the end, but we'll probably not read all of the comments since everybody can read those as we go along. And I should note that we are recording this meeting, and the recording as well as the slides will be posted afterwards. So our review of data centers began following a board matter from last May, and based on the direction from the board between May and January, an interagency staff team that was formed, researched, we held meetings with various stakeholders, we held a community meeting, we presented to Planning Commission and board committee meetings, and then that work resulted in the January 9th report, and that's posted on our project webpage. And then following that, there was a discussion at the board's Land Use Policy Committee meeting of March 12th about near-term enhancements that could be made to the zoning ordinance to strengthen the standards for data centers. And then following that, that was kind of captured in a board matter of March 19th, and that directed staff to work on a zoning ordinance amendment and to bring that amendment to the board by July. And that amendment is the subject of this meeting. So staff has put together draft text as well as a summary of the text, and that is also posted on the project webpage. And I'll be walking through that draft text in this presentation. Now, next steps include, well, we have one more community meeting, but then on Thursday, there is a meeting with the Planning Commission's Infrastructure Committee. And then following that, on June 5th, there will be a Planning Commission public hearing. And on July 16th, a Board of Supervisors public hearing. So for our review, we are focusing on buildings where all or most of the structure is designed for the data center use, and that's for the purpose of housing computer servers and their network connections. So these zoning ordinance standards, they would not apply to an accessory server room, really just the principal land use. But as you can see from the images on this slide, data centers come in various sizes and appearance. Their technology is continuing to evolve as well. And they can range in size from maybe 30,000 square feet to 500,000 square feet. They can be developed in individual buildings or campus development styles. And they can employ different cooling and other technologies which can influence potential land use impacts. And it is anticipated that the demand for data centers will continue to expand as they are a critical component of our modern lives. I am not going to go into a lot of background about data centers in this meeting, but if you're interested in additional information about data centers, you can check out that January 9th report. It does have some background information about data centers and topics related to their potential impacts. Now, currently, the zoning ordinance allows a data center by right in the C3 and C4, those are commercial office districts, up to 40,000 square feet in size, and also in the I2 and I3 industrial districts, up to 80,000 square feet in size. And then in all 4 of those districts, A larger size may be allowed with special exception approval or with the repurposing of an existing building. And the zoning ordinance also allows data centers by right in the I-4, I-5, and I-6 districts, as well as certain planned districts if it's shown on the approved development plan. Now, in addition to the permissions and the use-specific standards, any use has to meet all of the zoning ordinance regulations. On this slide, you're seeing the bulk regulations for those districts where data centers are permitted. So you can see that industrial districts generally have a 75-foot height limitation to exceed the height, or in the I-3 through I-6 to exceed the FAR. That can be approved with a special exception. Other zoning ordinance regulations apply as well, including parking, transitional screening and barriers, open space, outdoor lighting, and so forth. And the county has a separate noise ordinance that's separate from the zoning ordinance. The current use standards in the zoning ordinance include the size limits that I mentioned before, as well as a requirement, it's number 1 on this slide, for the HVAC equipment and the generators to be enclosed. And currently that standard does not apply in the I-4, I-5, and I-6 districts. All right, so now I'm going to move on to the draft text for the amendment, and beginning with the permissions and looking at that top table, you can see that an SE has been added for the I-4, I-5, and I-6 districts. And this pairs with the additional use standards that I'll be going over in just a moment. And it would allow for certain standards to be modified by SE. Now in the lower table, you can see that an option is shown to remove the permission for data centers in the PRC district. And there are not any existing or approved data centers in the PRC. And the only other industrial uses allowed are craft beverage production and small scale production. And both of those have a customer focus that would be compatible in the town center or convention conference center areas. And the text also shows that in the P district, the permissions have been revised to SE. And this is because some of the proffers allow all or most uses that are allowed in a district. And so this would ensure that the location has been specifically planned for a data center. But I want to note that as directed by the board, all options for permissions in these districts would be advertised for consideration. The draft text includes revisions to the standard for enclosure of equipment. The revised standard would apply in all districts, including the I-4, I-5, and I-6. It would specify that the purpose is to mitigate visual and noise impacts. It would apply to all HVAC equipment, generators, other power equipment, as well as accessory electrical substations. And the standard has also been revised to recognize that certain types of cooling systems aren't mechanically feasible to fully enclose. And if that is the case, and the text says as determined by the director of LDS, then a screening wall would still be required. And there have been questions in previous meetings about that determination, but it would be based on manufacturer specifications. So manufacturers specify to what degree equipment can be enclosed, and then staff would confirm that. But even if equipment such as a cooling tower can't be fully enclosed, a screening wall could still be required that provides some noise attenuation and that visual screening. So no changes are shown in the draft text for the maximum sizes in C3 and C4 and I2 and I3, but the I4 district has been added to the standard that would limit the size of a by right data center to 80,000 square feet. And an option is shown to either remove the allowance to exceed the size with by right repurposing within an existing building, or to add a maximum size for that by right repurposing, such as 200,000 square feet. No maximum size is shown for I-5 and I-6 in order to encourage data centers to locate in those heavier industrial districts. The draft text includes a setback for the building and any equipment, such as the generators, from a residential lot line. And the text includes a 200-foot setback, but provides for a consideration of a setback up to 500 feet. The 200 feet is based on a review of other use-specific setbacks in the zoning ordinance, such as a barn for livestock or poultry with an agricultural operation, an extraction activity, which is a quarry or a crematory. The text includes a setback of a half a mile from a metro station because these areas are planned for high population and employment centers. And then both of these setbacks could be modified with special exception approval. Now, of course, the zoning district setbacks, they continue to apply as well. And we also have transitional screening, and that is a landscaped buffer that's required between dissimilar adjoining uses. And transitional screening was recently amended as part of an overall update to the landscaping and screening provisions. And as part of that amendment, it was increased from 35 feet to 50 feet between industrial and residential uses. And this is the largest transitional screening yard in the zoning ordinance. To ensure that data centers are doing the upfront planning needed to make sure they will comply with the county's noise ordinance, the draft text includes submission requirements for a noise study to be submitted with a rezoning or special exception. Getting some feedback. I hope you're not getting it. If you haven't, please mute your microphones. The noise study would also be required before site plan approval. So this would apply to by right development as well. And before a post-construction study would be needed before issuance of the certificate of occupancy. The draft text includes building design standards for by right development for a main entrance feature, facade variation, and fenestration. That's windows and doors, and that may include fake windows. And then a more flexible standard for submission of architectural renderings and so forth when it's going through rezoning or special exception review. So here you have a diagram that shows what the by right standards could look like in the I-5 or I-6 district with a 75-foot tall building, a 200-foot setback from the building or from the generators, 50 feet of transitional screening, enclosure of the equipment, an entrance feature on the building, as well as the fenestration that I mentioned. Now, this meeting, as I said, is focused on the zoning ordinance amendment for data centers, but a separate review of the comprehensive plan, policy plan, is getting underway. The board has already authorized staff to amend the entire policy plan. The focus is on land use and environment in phase 1. And as part of that amendment, staff could include additional considerations for data centers that are reviewed through a rezoning or special exception process. And the county has a website for the policy plan amendment, which you can see on this slide. And I understand initial community engagement for that is set to begin this month. Now, there are certain topics for which the county does not have regulatory authority to address in the zoning ordinance, such as energy efficiency, sodium and cooling water discharges, or air quality emissions. It is possible that these topics will be further considered as part of the policy plan amendment. Now, currently within the comprehensive plan, the county does have an existing Appendix 12. It's in the land use element of that policy plan, and it has performance criteria that are used to review special exceptions for data centers for industrially planned parcels. And these criteria they ensure that proposals are compatible with surrounding uses, and they do take into consideration several environmental topics. And so that is the end of my slides. I do ask that you stay muted until we call on you, and then you can unmute and ask a question or make a comment. Now, some reminders first. There is one more community meeting. I think it's scheduled for Wednesday during the day at noon. But since you are here, all of these meetings are the same. So if you're here, you don't need to attend that meeting. They're just intended to provide flexibility for different schedules. But if you have additional thoughts, of course, please email the project email that you see here on the slide. And as I mentioned before, you might want to tune in to the Planning Commission's Infrastructure Committee meeting on Thursday at 8:30. You can catch that on channel 16. And then, of course, there are the upcoming public hearings on June 5th and July 16th. And so with that, I am going to stop sharing. And I don't know if we have any questions or.
Looks like Renee, I'll invite you to unmute your mic.
Hi there, Renee Grebe from Nature Forward here. I guess that was interesting to hear that ordinances can't include things like energy efficiency, sodium discharge, and air quality impacts, but they are part of the special exception. So it could be an option, theoretically, that there is not by right data center development so that there is more control over this really unique land use, which has massive energy needs over, I think, any other land use we have in the county, potentially really severe water impacts in terms of potentially withdrawal and discharge. Can you talk about any discussions that might have happened about why the county wouldn't want to propose having all data centers be special exception?
Sure. And the board did direct staff, and there was discussion. This was at the Land Use Policy Committee meeting of March 12th, and there was an indication that they wanted to make sure the amendment is advertised broadly so they could consider the various permission options. Now, we are showing in the draft text it basically comes down to the no maximum size, I would say, for I-5 and I-6, because the sizes are pretty limited for the other districts, and that would trigger the SE. Now, even in the I-5 and I-6, where we don't show a maximum size, the other requirements would still apply. So the setback from metro, the setback from residential, the screening, of course, and so forth. So all of those things, the noise study, that would still apply. But you're right, that wouldn't address the energy demand issue. But the purpose was really to say, like where in the county should data centers locate? That's kind of one of our fundamental questions under the zoning ordinance. And we do think that they are industrial uses. They're in that industrial classification. And so those are the heaviest industrial districts that we have. And so that's why we have that shown in the draft text. But all the options would be open for the board to consider as part of the public hearing process.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. And we have a few more questions in the chat. I'm going to do my best to address the questions in order, and I'll prioritize folks who weren't present to ask their questions in previous meetings. Elizabeth has a question in the chat, Carmen. Will the policy plan reevaluation address data center energy usage, i.e. energy usage as opposed to energy efficiency?
I don't know if we know that at this point, but Katie, do you want to maybe talk a minute about the policy plan process?
Oh, sure. So as Carmen mentioned on the slide a few minutes ago, there is a current comprehensive plan amendment to have staff update components of the policy plan. And so within that, we're going through a process to engage with stakeholders about current policies that are within certain portions of the policy plan as the first phase. And so as part of that, we anticipate collecting feedback on data centers in terms of energy efficiency. There may be an ability to look at energy usage as well. That's something that we haven't had a chance to really research fully yet, but hope to intend to here in the next several months while we prepare for the policy plan amendment and the next steps for that. So, thanks.
Thank you. And we have a question from Candace in the chat. Is there a way we can get the county to make sure that all data centers larger than 80,000 square feet, massive data centers must be approved through special exception, especially in I-5?
I think, and I know you, some people have made that comment to the board. So I'd encourage you that you can participate in the public hearing process to make sure the board understands that comment that you have. And we will work to make sure that's within the scope of advertising.
Thank you. And we have a question from Chris in the chat. What can the county do to get data centers to follow Amazon's example of being solar powered and battery backed up?
Hi, Chris. So I am curious to know which Amazon facility you're referring to. We always like to look at good examples. Now, the our regulatory authority doesn't allow us to dictate that they use renewables. That's something that currently, could be probably discussed if something was going through a rezoning. But and maybe that'll be addressed in the comp plan and the policy plan. I'm not really sure. But if you have an address or a general location for that one, I'd love to look into it more.
Thanks, Carmen. All right, we have a question from Cynthia in the chat. And Candace, I see your hand is raised and I'm going to get to you next. Cynthia's question is, you mentioned 3 things that the county cannot regulate, such as energy efficiency, but can you restate that list? The 3 things that the county cannot regulate, such as energy efficiency. You're muted, Carmen.
Sorry. I mentioned energy efficiency and renewables, air quality emissions, and the sodium in wastewater discharges.
Thanks, Carmen. Now, Candace, would you like to unmute your mic?
Yes, sure. Good evening, everyone. I had a question. I saw the example of the data center with the, the scale and numbers of how far the setbacks were and everything. Honestly, I don't know if you can bring that back up or not. If you can, that'd be great. If not, it was quite disturbing to me due to the fact that it was very close to residential areas. Is there a way that we can have the county look at and kind of be considerate of residential areas that are really close to neighborhoods and people's homes? One, it's a very big eyesore, and 2, as you were saying with the noise ordinance, being that close to someone's home is disturbing, and also with whatever radiation is coming off of these basically power plants, and then now you're saying they can't regulate or how much waste is being discharged into the environment. Like, is there a way that we can have these meetings to amend how close they are to residential homes? Like the setback being increased, like either a half a mile or however many. 200 feet is way too close to somebody's home, literally in their backyard.
All right, sorry, I was starting to talk again for unmuting. You'd think I'd done this before, but anyway, so I appreciate your comment. The diagram, I'm not going to put it back up only because it's just a diagram, and it was intended to illustrate what could it look like if you had, it's just a little SketchUp diagram showing to scale. What is a 200-foot setback and, the 50-foot screening? What does that look like if there was residential nearby? There are areas in the county where there's residential next to really every district, right? I mean, Fairfax County is predominantly a suburban county, and there's residential really everywhere. So it's in some places there is residential. And so we just kind of wanted to take a look at that. So I hear your comment about recommending a larger setback. I think you said a half a mile. Is that right?
Something around those lines, maybe like 2,600 feet or so. I'm just saying the diagram, to scale or not to scale, it was very disturbing at how close that data center is to someone's home. I know that there is an issue with a neighborhood, a proposed data center that's less than 100 feet behind someone's home, and that's quite disturbing to have that large capacity of a building being built or restructured to house a data center that's that close. People, walk their dogs there, they take their strolls there, there's a stream, like, in which, again, when you're saying there's environmental issues that you guys cannot control, the waste going into that stream that, animals and, the environment needs to, I guess, for the ecosystem totally.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Mhm. I understand, and I hear your comment about, proposing a larger setback. I do want to speak to a couple of the topics because I don't want to, I feel like I was unclear before. On the topic about wastewater discharge, that is, so certain types of cooling systems, and this isn't just for a data center, this is for any, say any commercial industrial use might have a different types of cooling systems, such as a cooling tower. And sometimes those cooling systems, they have a discharge that is, it could go to stormwater. In our experience, it goes to the wastewater system. And sometimes, again, it's highly variable. And I understand that newer systems are doing this much less often, but it is possible that they can concentrate the salts. And then if that's going into the wastewater system, then the wastewater system in some places then, is ultimately discharged where it could potentially affect, say, if it's going to the Upper Occoquan Service Authority, it could be an impact on sodium in potable water. And so that's of concern. But there isn't we don't have an enforceable standard for sodium levels. So that's what I was kind of getting at. It's not that they're dumping waste in the streams or anything like that. That's definitely not allowed. And as far as like stormwater runoff, data centers are regulated just like every other use for sure. On the wastewater and whether data centers or other uses and the degree to which they contribute to sodium levels. I understand that there are going to be some studies that are going to be going on in the future to kind of quantify what the different uses impacts might be. So that'll be helpful information to have when that's available, but we don't even have that right now. And then as far as noise goes, regardless of the setback, and while, distance is definitely your friend when it comes to noise, if you back up from a noise, it's definitely going to, make that noise lessen for you. But the noise ordinance that the county has, it sets decibel levels, and it's based on the receiving district. So for instance, at night, if you're in a residential area, then the maximum is 55 decibels. And so that is regardless of whether you're 200 feet or 500 feet or a half a mile. That noise ordinance standard would apply. And that's why we included the draft standard where they're going to do the study to show up front that they've included the baffles or the better enclosures, or there's a lot of different tricks that they can employ to really mitigate noise levels so that they've done what they need to do to make sure that their equipment in this location meets the noise ordinance. I hope that helps. I do see there's some other, maybe Renee and others people have something to say.
Renee, I'll invite you to unmute your mic.
Sure. I just had another question. I don't have anything to say on what you were mentioning. Earlier, as you started off, Carmen, you mentioned that different cooling techniques mean different land use impacts. Obviously, you're talking about some of them there. How does the ordinance address that?
I'm not sure I know what your question might be.
How does the ordinance address the fact that different cooling techniques mean different land use impacts? I mean, you mentioned that this ordinance is specifically for the land use, or it's not for smaller server areas or such. And so if we know that we have different cooling techniques mean different land use impacts, those were your words. I don't know what that means.
No.
I need to look more into it. I mean, I have a sense of what it means, but you didn't go into that in detail. But then how does this ordinance account for that? Since this is a land use ordinance.
Absolutely. So I think it's important to recognize that not all data centers are the same. And that's part of what I mean by that. That some, we can go visit many data centers without taking a very long drive. And I think people should. I think I like field trips myself. So there are some, that they're just that are huge, and maybe you think they're noisy, others not so much. And so that's part of what I was getting at, but that there are different technologies that can influence impacts. And one of those would be, for instance, noise, right? So some systems might be louder than others. But again, that noise ordinance is a performance-based standard. So regardless of what technology they choose, they're going to need to figure out a way to meet the noise ordinance. And cooling systems can also impact water. And so I want to talk a little bit more about that for just a minute, because I also see Cynthia had a question about water. And we've certainly read about data centers in other locations that use a lot of water. For our purpose, we did coordinate with Fairfax Water, and they have, I think, a really helpful letter that's included in the January 9th report. And they did an analysis, and they also coordinated with Loudoun and Prince William, since they have more data centers than we do, to kind of broaden the sample of review. And, based on our review, data centers are not using a lot of water here. And so Fairfax Water does do, they do periodic, I think, annual reviews. And so, if that starts to change, that's something that would be captured in their review, and things might need to be revisited at that time. But at this point, we just don't have the information to say that data centers in this area are large water users.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carmen. We have another question in the chat. Candace asking, I'm not sure how many people would like or prefer a data center right behind or next to their homes, or would they purchase a home knowing a data center is or will be built right next to the neighborhood they want to buy in? And how much power or electricity are data centers using?
I don't actually know, in total from, how much electricity data centers in Fairfax County are using currently. I'm sorry.
Candace is relaying a question from someone who's having issues with their phone. How much radiation will the data center be putting out?
I confess, I also don't know that. I have not heard that. That wasn't identified as a topic when we did our research and issued our report. So that's something that I would have to look into.
Okay, I'll invite Cynthia to unmute her mic.
Yeah, sorry, I just put in the chat a link to a data center that was proposed and approved in January. And the link is to the proffers. And I wanted to point out here and ask a question. Chairman McKay held up these proffers as an example of how through the special exception process we can mitigate impacts through the proffers. So considering the list of things I'm hearing that we cannot as a county mitigate upfront with by right data centers, has the data center group here thought about reviewing this set of proffers and seeing if there's anything else we may have missed in terms of things we can actually mitigate? Because there were, I think, well over 30 proffers for just the data center alone. And I know, you can't always think of everything, and maybe there was something in there that might be helpful that you go, oh, wait, we can, regulate that. So just curious to know if that might be considered, as an example to tighten up some of the regulations. Thank you.
Thank you. We definitely have been following and were following the Chantilly Premier case, and definitely those proffers have been a good resource.
Great. We have a question from Elizabeth in the chat. Are by right data centers allowed in P districts and plan districts?
Finally, a question I feel like I can answer. So plan districts, while the zoning ordinance might list, what's allowed, by right, really nothing is by right in a plan district. It has to be specifically approved. And so, for instance, in the planned development commercial PDC district, there's a list of uses that are allowed. And even those that are permitted uses, they need to be approved in the proffers and shown on a final development plan. So that's, they're subject to they have added flexibility in planned districts. For instance, there are no specific setbacks and so forth, but that flexibility comes with added scrutiny through that rezoning process.
Thanks, Carmen. And we have another question from Candace in the chat. Is there a way to stop a data center and or substation from being constructed directly behind our homes?
I don't know. I'm sorry.
Renee, I'll invite you to unmute your mic.
Thank you. Another question I have is about stormwater runoff. I know for using the Bryn Mawr proposed data center as an example, that's built significantly. It's already currently developed. It's already a currently developed site. It already has a lot of impervious surface on it. It already has a lot of building within the RPA. And it's just an example. I don't want to dive into that exactly, but what we are talking about, this is a by right development, so it would apply to any of these other potential by right things. When you have something that's by right and you're looking at impervious surface, there are requirements to improve the stormwater runoff, which we know with our heavier storms, our more frequent storms as we progress down this climate change path. We know this is going to get worse. And we have some things we can do to mitigate because you have to improve that. But it is typically, I know this from talking with stormwater folks, it is typically the worst case scenario, the worst amount of improvement that you get when you build on a place that has high impervious surface. The requirements are very low. You don't have to improve the site very much. And so my question is, again, this kind of by right question, what are we doing to mitigate these impacts of stormwater that we know is so important, particularly in these by right examples? And is there anything that can be done in this ordinance to regulate a stronger requirement in terms of capturing a reasonable amount of stormwater compared to what we have to today in an already built environment?
As you I think alluded to, the county has separate stormwater regulations, and they apply across the board. So not just data centers, every use, they're treated consistently. And so I think that if there was going to be a relook at stormwater requirements, they would need to be done in the context of that, right? So, what are in the stormwater management ordinance, and other related regulations, those would need to be reviewed. It's not a data, like why would a data center be treated differently would have to be the legal question, right? So I think that might be a bit of a different topic. For our stormwater regulations adequate for by right redevelopment scenarios? That's kind of beyond what we can do just as part of this particular amendment. What does the zoning ordinance have in it? It does have, the same things that apply to other developments. It has open space standards, but the stormwater management really is regulated separately. It's a good question, but it's just not one that I can probably help with.
Yeah, it's interesting to say things like, why would a data center be treated differently? You're right, in stormwater, there isn't too much of a difference, but in so many things like potentially water usage and certainly energy usage, there's a massive difference. And yet you're saying we can't regulate that either. So it's really a challenge to hear that data centers are so different from typical uses. And yet doesn't sound like there's really anything we can do if they're by right. There's nothing. But there's special exception, we can do a lot.
I don't feel all that negative. I hear you that maybe it's not able to do everything and check every box that everyone would like. But the draft text that's been posted, I think strengthening the standard for that relates to noise and visual. Those are both great topics that impact people who may have, as it's been expressed here, what if a data center were proposed near your home? Well, you would want it to look better and you would want it to be quieter. And I think the enclosure requirement or the screening wall requirement and the aesthetic, the building design standards, I think they're both helpful. So while, we might not have the enabling authority to do everything, I think that what I heard as the direction from the board was they want to do a zoning ordinance amendment that can do what it can, and they want to do it quickly. And so that's what our goal is here. And I don't want to discount anybody's concerns. And I don't want to say that there aren't other concerns that might need a different avenue, but it doesn't mean that what we can do isn't worthwhile. I'll get off my soapbox.
I would agree with that, but I guess for the others on this call that are not staff, if we want more than just noise and visual, which are two absolutely incredibly important things when you're the one being impacted, we're all being impacted by all the other impacts that are happening. They're not felt by one person, they're felt by all of us. And those are big, important things as we try to reach our CCAP goals, our climate goals. And special exceptions can get us closer. This ordinance can get us closer if the board chooses to push us that far. So I'll just say that.
Thank you. And we have a question from Cynthia in the chat. What are the reasons for the 40,000 square feet or 80,000 square feet restriction?
Sure. Currently, as I indicated, the zoning ordinance limits data centers in the I2 and I3. And then the draft text proposes to add I4 to that 80,000 square feet. And this was to try to put, somewhat of a limit. These are industrial districts, but they're not the heaviest industrial districts. The 80,000 square feet does mirror the maximum size allowed under the big box retail use, retail sales large. 40,000 square feet is, well, half of that. And it is intended to make sure that we don't have large industrial uses in commercial office districts. Those are not industrial districts. And so, we wanted to acknowledge that there might be some smaller data centers that could maybe fit in, but if it's larger, it wouldn't be compatible necessarily with the uses that are allowed in that district.
Thank you, Carmen. And we have a question from Candace in the chat. Is the Planning and Development Committee in talks with Dominion Energy, where there have been new meters installed in homes? Does that mean that the substation is already going in and will make our energy bills increase?
Candace, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that. Yeah, I don't know if there's someone, if you have a contact with Dominion Energy that you could check in with about that. If you're referring to the substation that's part of the proposed data center at Starwood Plaza 500, I don't believe that substation has been approved yet.
Thank you, Carmen. And Elizabeth had a question in the chat, something about the significance of the underlining of SE in the use table, but I pulled it up. Yeah. And I pulled it up and I didn't see any underlining. Do you know what she's referring, what Elizabeth is referring to, Carmen?
I mean, I think it should be underlined. I think it is. I don't know if there's something, with the way it appeared on your screen, but there should be an underline with the SE under I-4, I-5, and I-6. And that's just showing that that's a new permission. So currently, the zoning ordinance just has a P for I-4, I-5, and I-6.
We don't have anyone with their hand raised or any other questions in the chat. Cynthia.
Yeah, sorry, I can't type fast enough. I just had a question. I just to clarify, in the C3, C4, as an example, talking about building size again, it says option to delete this allowance for a larger size in an existing building or to add a maximum size of up to 200,000 square feet of gross floor area when the use is located in an existing building. So two parts to this. Then I'm trying to understand: are we saying that we could recommend that if a building was to be repurposed and the size of the building was 200,000 square feet, then that would be a by right, and they could just go ahead and try to repurpose that building? And then my second question to that would be, I know in the Franconia district, Amazon purchased a large site that had two very large office buildings over 200, or maybe I think it was at least 200,000 square feet, but they decided to demolish them. So my second question was, is that also considered a repurposing?
Yeah, those are good questions. Repurposing would definitely not be tearing down and rebuilding. Repurposing would be very limited. You would be taking the existing building and using it. Sometimes with repurposing, I'm sure they can change the facade. I'm going to say, and if there's anybody from industry on the line who feels like they want to contribute to this conversation, but to my knowledge, we have not seen any repurposing. It may have been a wishful standard that we put in there. You know, the county does have a policy that we would like to encourage repurposing of existing vacant buildings. But I just think from what I have heard, with the specific needs for the design of data centers, repurposing just might not really be very feasible. But what the standard currently allows is an unlimited size. I mean, of course, it's always regulated by the FAR in height, but you know, there's no specific size if they're repurposing an existing building in those districts. So that's currently allowed. Like I said, it hasn't happened, but it's there. And so the draft text is just kind of trying to suggest that maybe some revisions should be considered. Maybe there should be a cap. Maybe it's not an unlimited size with repurposing, or maybe we just remove that and we don't allow repurposing to exceed the size, the 40 or the 80,000 square feet. So if you have thoughts on that,
Yep.
we would love to hear them.
Great, thank you. I'll email them in. Thank you. Actually, let me just say one thing. And the reason why I thought of that too was because, again, with the rapidly moving technologies, you know, with AI and quantum and such, that we know that maybe an 80,000 square foot certainly now could hold, or a 200,000 square foot could hold certain technologies that are up and coming, whereas nowadays it doesn't. And that's why I was really kind of looking at the size issue, just to understand, you know, what the thought process was behind it. So thank you for that.
We have a question from Al in the chat. Would data centers be allowed in the Occoquan watershed?
Yes, so there are some zoning districts that allow data centers are within the Occoquan watershed. So if they met all the other standards, that still would be allowed.
Question from Chris in the chat. Is there a limit to the number of data centers that the county can hold, given the land use plans?
I'm sure there is a limit, but I don't know what it is. I mean, even when I think, that, this is a general zoning ordinance that applies countywide. And while we could certainly look at a map and count up how many acres we have in each zoning district right now, that doesn't mean that there couldn't be a proposed rezoning that could change things. Lots can be consolidated, so in theory, I would say no, but then we also have to look at the comprehensive plan, and something can't be rezoned unless it complies with the comprehensive plan. Maybe that's a long way of saying it's complicated, and I don't know, but.
Thanks, Carmen. There's a question from Mark in the chat. He'd like for someone to comment on the light pollution, since data centers require 24/7 security, which includes light. There are major health concerns associated with a data center right by a house, especially at 200 feet. So, question is asking about light pollution.
Yeah, so the zoning ordinance does have standards about outdoor lighting. They're found in section 5109, and they would apply to a data center just like other uses. So for instance, they would require full cutoff lights that are mounted horizontal to the ground. They can also have some motion activated lights, but then they need to turn off within 5 minutes of motion ceasing and be directed within the property boundary. There's a maximum color temperature of 3000 K. So those standards apply across the board for non-residential uses. And then there are some separate standards for residential. So we do have those standards that would help mitigate light pollution.
There's another question in the chat from Candace. There's a vacant building on Eisenhower that has 629,000 square feet, been empty for years. Why can't they put a data center there? Are you familiar with that
Yeah.
building?
I'm not, but
A question from Mark in the chat. Can you also comment on increased traffic associated with data center worker commutes, as well as other work trucks and vehicles?
yeah, so actually typically traffic is of a lesser concern with a data center than many other commercial or industrial uses. They do have employees, of course, but not as many as, for instance, an office or even like a warehouse type use. So fewer workers and fewer deliveries than many other industrial uses. So typically, traffic is not identified as a major concern with data centers.
They don't. Cynthia?
Sorry, I'm really having trouble typing. So just to understand, so is there something as part of either the site plan process, or maybe it's just part of the application process, but is any type of facility, even down to a hospital, because we know that they use backup generators, of course, as well. Is there any type of requirement that they provide how much diesel or hazardous toxic fluids or fuels that they would be storing on site? And so my question is that a requirement? And if it is it part of the application phase or the site plan phase or what?
So you're asking if there's a way to know how many like gallons of diesel fuel they might store on site? Is that your question?
Well, like I saw that in one of the applications, there was a section about, toxic and hazardous waste. And they did list in there how many gallons of diesel fuel they would store on site. And so I was just wondering if that was just something that they voluntarily provided, or is there a requirement to provide that information at some point in the process?
I'm not aware. I'm not sure. That might be something I need to check with LDS if that comes up during site plan review. And the generators. Well, let me back up. Let me think a minute.
Okay.
So we do have a fuel storage tank review process, and so for gasoline or diesel, that is reviewed and inspected by the Office of the Fire Marshal. So they would definitely have that information. And so I know that it comes up there. I'm not sure if it comes up in other places as well.
Okay, thank you. So you're not sure if it's part of the application process or the site plan or something like that. So
what do you mean by the application process?
I'm so sorry. No, I'm so sorry. So when and I'll just use Chantilly Premier as an example, when they as part of like the staff report, I didn't see in the terms of the application, but I assume that the staff report works through any kind of application. So I'm probably using the words all wrong. But as part of the staff report, there was a section regarding toxic and hazardous materials that might be stored on site. But I wasn't sure if that's a normal thing or if that was something voluntary that they provided. And I was wondering if you might know.
Well, I did put a link in the chat to the fuel storage tank program. So hopefully that helps.
No, I guess I'll find out then from I was just trying to find out if it's, they have to provide certain information. I didn't know if that was a piece of information that, regardless of what application you are, whether you're a hospital or something else, that you have to provide what quantities of toxic or hazardous and what type of toxic or hazardous fluids or fuels you might actually be storing on site. I just was trying to find out where in that process that information might be required.
Okay.
Okay, we have a question from Renee in the chat regarding the fake windows you mentioned earlier in the presentation, Carmen. Can you talk about if the ordinance can account for requiring those windows to be treated with bird-safe features to eliminate bird collisions?
I don't think we currently have anything in the ordinance about that, but thank you for your comment.
A question from Mark. Can you talk about health concerns associated with data centers? Associated with data centers located 200 feet from I'm assuming a home? You're muted, Carmen.
I'm sorry, I'm not really sure that I can comment on health concerns related to that. Yeah.
And another question from Mark. How do you anticipate the data center impacting property values in the surrounding area? And also, how can residents express their concerns further?
Okay, well, the easy part, how can you express your concerns further? If you have additional questions or comments, staff would love to hear them, and we'll put the email in the chat as well. We'd love to hear from you. And then, of course, the public hearings are always an opportunity. So on June 5th, there's a Planning Commission public hearing, and it's actually starting earlier than normal. So it's starting at 7 p.m. And then on July 16th, the Board of Supervisors public hearing will be taking place as well. And wait, I answered the easy part. Was there more to the question, Janan?
Property values.
Property
How
value.
do you anticipate the data center impacting property values in the area?
Yeah, so that's not something that we have looked at, but when we look at standards that address, we're more focused on mitigating impacts. And so the setbacks and the noise ordinance and the transitional screening and all of those zoning ordinance provisions are intended to help make sure that we do have a compatible land uses and a well-planned community. And so that always helps property values.
And a question from Candace: Does the planning committee know who the developers are for the data centers, for the proposed data centers?
I don't know if there's one in particular that you're interested in. I mean, whenever somebody submits an application, somebody is the applicant.
I'm just asking, are they, the developers are the ones that come to you, so you know what developer is planning to build something in the county, right? Okay, so you know each and every one that applies for a permit to, or I guess by right doesn't need a permit, correct?
Oh, they do. They absolutely do. So they have to go through a site plan process, and then there's many layers of regulations. But a lot of times their first step would be a site plan application. There's, of course, building plans and other regulations that they need to meet. So by right doesn't mean, carte blanche by any means.
Oh, good. So you know each and every developer that plans to build a data
I
center.
mean, not me personally.
Right, meaning the planning committee, right? So they know who wants to make or build or repurpose a building in whatever district of Fairfax County.
Well, I guess I'll say there's always an applicant. And sometimes it depends on the scenario. Sometimes there's a developer who might be doing the planning and even construction perhaps, and then they might sell it to an end user ultimately. So sometimes that end user isn't immediately known, if that's what you're getting at.
You're answering two-part questions. So okay, that's fine. So in general, there is an application process, and whoever the applicant is doesn't necessarily have to be the developer themselves. It could be like the highest bidder or whoever wants to purchase the land or something like that.
Usually, so the applicant is going to be the one taking it through that stage of the application process, but that isn't to mean that ultimately they won't sell it, right?
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Carmen. We have a question from Elizabeth. On table 4 for planned development districts, does the check mark with the line through it mean it's an option to not make those by right, but instead by special exception, whereas the main option listed is by right in planned development districts? I think it was a question on the way the table is.
It takes a minute for me to load it, but I'm going to try. Sorry. It'll be up momentarily. Okay, are you seeing the table now?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so so small for me. Make it bigger. Okay. So under this bottom table for the planned districts, option 1, this is the PRC, planned residential community, and then currently it's allowed if shown on the approved development plan in the town center and the convention conference center areas. And option 1 is showing that would no longer be allowed. So just across the board, no data centers in any area of the PRC under option 1. Under option 2, they stay as a possibility, but we're showing in any event that in all the planned districts, it would be a special exception approval. In most cases, because the planned districts, they are specifically approved by the board. And so if they hadn't already planned for a data center, they would need to do probably what we call a PCA or a proffered condition amendment to add the use to the zoning and to the development plan. So the special exception, it also goes to the board. Either way, I think they end up with a trip to the board. But we felt like the SE was a little bit of a cleaner option for them to be sure that they have planned that specific location for that use. So that's why that's just two different options. One is no data centers in PRC, and one is keeping it, but consistent with our recommendation for PDC and PTC, it require an SE. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, we have one question from Al in the chat. Does an applicant have the power of eminent domain to acquire land for a data center, much like a public utility?
Nope, these are private private developments, and they do not have the power of eminent domain.
No one has. Okay. Okay, we don't have any other questions in the chat. No one with their hand raised.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming out and spending your Monday evening with us talking about data centers. As I mentioned, there are the upcoming meetings, and if you're interested, I encourage you to tune in to the Planning Commission committee meeting on Thursday. Although I confess the presentation might be very similar, so you might want to skip the first few minutes and just listen to the questions and discussion. But then the public hearings that are coming up. So thank you. Have a great evening.
Thanks, Carmen.